Hey class, I'm getting this up a little later than I said I would, but all of us have other duties in life, so I apologize for this being put up on Sunday morning rather than getting it up on Saturday morning. Now, this past Friday, we were talking about D-Day. Now, just to rehash what we went over, the German plan to defend Europe was pretty simple if you really look at it. The Germans, of course, had to fortify, or tried to fortify, every square inch of beach from Norway all the way down to the coast, or down to the border with Spain and France. Now the problem is this meant that the defense, the German defenders, were spread thin. This is why Hitler needed the Atlantic Wall. This, of course, was the brainchild of General Erwin Rommel. Rommel understood that without the necessary manpower, that you had to rely upon heavy guns, beach fortifications, obstacles, and things like that to slow the Allies down. Now, Rundstedt's boss, a fellow by the name of von Rundstedt, Gerd von Rundstedt, wanted to keep the troops centralized. As I mentioned, if this is Paris, he stationed Panzer Army West, or Panzer Group West, which was a huge panzer force, armored force, tanks, here just northwest of Paris. The intent was for Rundstedt that if the Allies landed anywhere in France, that these panzer troops could move to push them back off the beach. There was one fatal flaw, though. The conflict between Rommel and Rundstedt, both of which were accomplished generals, meant that Hitler split the difference by keeping command of those troops for himself. He would not release those troops unless he thought the invasion was going on. So, as we talked about last class period, the Allies landed here in Normandy. But during Operation Overlord, there was a subsidiary operation called Operation Fortitude, designed to trick the Germans into thinking we were going to land here in Calais. For this reason, Hitler refused until the end of the end of June 6, 1944, going into June 7th, to release those troops, because Hitler and his generals back in Berlin believed that Normandy was merely a feint, merely a diversion, the real invasion coming at Calais. So the Germans got it completely flip-flopped. They bought into the deception and thought that the real invasion was the deception. This allowed the Allies to get ashore. Now, the problem for the Allies is that the beaches and the land right behind it still had German defenders, even without these panzer troops pouring down on them. And in this part of France, this is known as hedgerow country. The problem for the Americans and the British, especially the Americans coming off of Utah and Omaha, was that right behind the beaches you had these hedgerows, which made perfect fortifications. Because when we think of hedgerows in this country, we think of English hedgerows. We think of these hedgerows that are 2, maybe 3 feet tall, 2 or 3 feet wide and deep, and something that you played in as children. Well, French hedgerows are products of the medieval era. They'd been there for centuries. They could be as high as 20 feet tall. They could be as thick as 20 feet. And their roots had been there so long that they'd mounded up, so it was a combination of roots and dirt. And so these things were practically immovable. And if a tank tried to cross them, they would literally climb up over them, of course exposing their weak belly armor. And if troops tried to crawl through them, It was like fighting this mass of plant life, of course alerting the Germans to where the breach was going to come. The Allies, of course, tried using tanks equipped with bulldozer blades. Of course, these were easily spotted because, you have a tank with a dozer blade on the front of it. And, of course, the Germans knew that wherever the dozer was wherever the breach was going to be. And so you have these rectangular mini forts that the Germans, of course, have pre-sighted all the openings, that they have sort of evacuation plans so that they can fall back, holding up the Allies. Again, this is where not the higher echelons of command come up with a solution, but just regular infantrymen and soldiers' ingenuity. An American soldier by the name of Cullen, he was actually an ordnance soldier, so he was the guy that fixed tanks, came up with the idea of taking these beach obstacles that had been pulled out of the ground and piled up to clear the beach, to cut them up and put spikes, basically giant salad forks, on the front of the tanks. These become known as hedgehogs or Cullen hedgerow devices. And this allowed the tanks to spear the hedgerows and push them in front of them rather than the tanks crawling up over them. Any defenders behind that particular part of hedgerow would be buried. And it allowed multiple tanks to make multiple penetrations into the hedgerows, so the Germans didn't know where the attack was going to be. Now, this, of course, combined with probably one of the most spectacular bombing raids of World War II. It preceded an operation known as Cobra. Right in here, the U.S. Strategic Air Forces were taken off their task of flying from Britain to deep within Europe. And instead, the Strategic Air Forces were used to carpet bomb just a few square miles of the front line, obliterating the German defenders. Now, sadly, some of the bombers got off course and lost their aim point in the smoke and debris of the previous raids, and actually dropped their bombs on Americans. But it did its job. It opened the doorway for the Americans to bust out through the hedgerows and start swinging down here toward Paris. Now, as the Allies start moving, the British here out of Sword, Gold, and Juno, the Americans start making this wide swath across France. The Germans, of course, start to retreat. And, of course, this is where the effect of one man in history can be really felt, because Hitler ordered his troops to turn around and counterattack, despite the fact that his ground commanders were at a disadvantage. And so they counterattack at a place called Mortain, right up in here. Now, the Allies are already sweeping down here and already pouring down through here. So they've caught the Germans in a pocket. Now, as the Germans realize that the counterattack has failed and start to try and retreat, they are caught in a pincer movement between Falaise in the north and, I can't remember the name of the city in the south. It starts with an A. It's not Argenton, I don't think. But what becomes known as the Falaise Gap. The Germans start to pour through this gap, and it's only about a mile wide. So the Allies are on both sides of this gap. The British here in the north, the Americans here in the south. For a short period of time, the hole is actually plugged by a Free Polish Tank Division, who they get their butt shot off, but they hold up the Germans just long enough for their allies to get here and get to the point where Allied artillerymen, don't even have to aim. They just look down the bores of their barrel and start shooting, large caliber shells into the Germans. It's a slaughter. Eisenhower, who is the supreme commander, said that it was probably the most brutal show of military force that he'd ever seen when he visited the battlefield after, of course, the front line had moved on. Now, after, of course, the Germans are chewed up here at the Falaise Gap, they are retreating headlong back toward Germany. Now, Normandy is not the only invasion of France. If we go back to the map here, we will notice that just about a month later, August of 1944, we see Operation Overlord up here. Down here, Operation Dragoon is the invasion of southern France. So when the Allies land here in southern France, they start pushing up toward the German border. The Germans that are here, again, are caught off guard and have to flood back as quickly as possible, not mounting any kind of real defense, to avoid being caught between this pincer movement of the Allies coming here from Normandy and the Allies coming here from southern France. So this helps explain how France was liberated so quickly, because basically everything down here in south, the Allies did not have to fight for. The battles are here as the Germans try and get through this pincer movement. They try and get out, and the Allies, of course, are trying to keep them in so that they can destroy them. Now, getting back to the map here, as we can see in this map, only part of France is shown. This gives me a good example of some of the problems that the Allies had, because they had expected the Germans to put up a much harder fight. And so as the Allies pour across France, the timetable is actually not delayed, but accelerated. I've actually seen the original timeline, which you see with lines drawn on the map, where the Allies should be at certain dates. Paris was not supposed to be liberated until the very end of 1944. However, the Allies moved into Paris in September of 1944. The Germans, basically not wanting to fight for the city, the German commander, I can't remember his name just off the top of my head, did not want to be known as the man who destroyed the City of Light, give up the city, move out of Paris, and start heading back to Germany. So the Allies, outside of having to fight a couple of snipers and rear guards, they walk into Paris unmolested. The advance happens so quickly that beyond Paris, there's a classic case in point where a commander of a tank outfit has to break into a French gas station, not to steal anything except road maps, because the map that he had been given was even smaller than the one you see here on the screen. Because when you're fighting a war like this, you don't want to give your frontline commanders detailed maps that are large scale. You want detailed maps of certain sectors, because in case that unit is overrun or defeated and those maps fall into enemy hands, the enemy doesn't have, of course, a blueprint to your plans. The problem is this tank commander had run off his maps. He went beyond the maps that he had, and he needed, of course, road maps to keep going, to know where to go. To get, he's getting orders over the radio, and he doesn't know what they're even talking about without maps. So he steals tourist maps. And so by the end of 1944, the Allies have moved into Belgium. They are here along the Franco-German border. The problem for the Allies is that they have moved so quickly. They have overrun or overstretched their supply lines. They had counted, in terms of supply, on being able to build up the transportation network, the rail network especially of France, as they went along. But they've completely went faster than that, meaning that the bridges and especially the railroads have been bombed by the Allies to keep the Germans from reinforcing themselves. They've not been repaired yet. So the Allies, of course, have to slow down their advance. In some sectors, they come to a complete halt. The Allies try and remediate this by coming up with what becomes known as the Red Ball Express, which is basically running trucks non-stop, 24 hours a day, in a circular pattern from Normandy to the front line and back again. Red Ball roads were roads that you could only be on if your truck, of course, had a big red circle painted on it. And MPs policed these roads, making sure that only Red Ball Express trucks were the ones using these routes. Now, this, of course, is a good place to show that all Americans contributed to our victory, because the largest percentage of African Americans, of black Americans, who served in World War II served in the Quartermaster Corps. They were not frontline troops until the desperate need for troops was, needed in late 1944, 1945. Most black troops in the U.S. Army were either artillerymen, ordnance officers, or quartermaster, or ordnance troops, not officers, ordnance troops, or quartermaster troops, meaning that these are guys who drove supply trucks. And so you have these supply trucks being driven by black and white troops, that you would have two guys in the cab, one driving, one sleeping, and after about 6 or 7 hours, they would change places so that the guy who had been driving slept, and the other guy drove. Non-stop. Kept going. Unless the truck needed gas or it broke down, they did not stop. But even with this Herculean supply effort, the Allies had to pick and choose their battles. And of course, this created tension, because Eisenhower wanted to avoid making narrow thrust into enemy territory for fear that those penetrations could easily be outflanked and cut off. This is why we see in World War II what becomes known as the broad front strategy, where the Allies advance in this uniform wall almost. However, in late September of 1944, British General Bernard Montgomery, who was command of the British and Canadians here in the north, persuaded Eisenhower on a really daring plan that becomes known as Market Garden. Market Garden was a two-phase plan. The market part of Market Garden was where the Allies would airdrop paratroopers into Belgium, Holland, and just here at the border of the Netherlands and Holland, where the Rhine River runs through, to capture the bridges across the rivers until the last one here at Arnhem, the Rhine River, was captured as well. The garden part of Market Garden was where the British 30th Armored Corps, or the 30 Corps as they called it, would race along the road that these paratroopers had seized the bridges on, liberating the towns along the way and relieving the paratroopers until they got to Arnhem. And of course, if they captured Arnhem, they would have had a foothold across the Rhine, and then they could have attacked across into Germany, here, straight at Berlin. Now, if you've ever read the book A Bridge Too Far or watched the movie, and I'll warn you, the movie is very informative, very historically correct, but it is incredibly boring and long. You will see that Market Garden was doomed almost from the get-go by poor planning. Rushed planning is the better way to put it. And the fact that the Allies underestimated the German capabilities, because what had happened is those troops that had been evacuating France were stationed here along the French-German border, so that when the British 1st Airborne Division parachutes into Arnhem, they land right on top of 2 Panzer divisions. Now, paratroopers are guys that have rifles and maybe some shoulder-mounted anti-tank weapons. They are not equipped to handle an armored division, let alone 2 of them. And so, we see this very sad end to Market Garden, where you see this heroic effort by both American paratroopers and British paratroopers, and of course British 30 Corps, to try and beat the Germans to these towns, only to have the timetable disrupted. And see, the Allies fell into the same trap that the Germans and especially the Japanese often fell into in World War II, which was having highly detailed, down-to-the-minute plans. And Market Garden, from the very beginning, the timetable was upset. And so the troops at Arnhem, or the survivors of those troops, have to be evacuated across the Rhine, back into Allied territory. And so the Allies do not get that foothold across the Rhine. And they liberate much of Belgium and much of Holland, but they still do not get that foothold. So instead, Eisenhower goes back to the broad front strategy. And after the failure of Market Garden, the Allies will again share their resources. They will work to improve their port facilities here, improve the transportation networks, but they will march in unison toward the French-German border, and then once across it, toward the Rhine River. So at the end of 1944, the Allies are here. Some are across the German border, but mainly they're right on the border between France and Germany. This, of course, set the stage for another climactic battle of World War II. This was, of course, the Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge was what many consider Germany's last desperate attempt to offset the material and superior manpower of the Allies. The German plan, and this is something that historians still don't agree upon, the German plan was to attack here in the Ardennes, to push forward toward the Belgian port of Antwerp, cut the northern Allied armies off from the southern armies. And some historians argue that Hitler believed that this would cause a disruption in the Allied command structure and cause the Allies to shatter, thus relieving pressure on Germany. Other historians, more modern interpretations, argue that Hitler actually was planning on trying to negotiate a peace with the Allies and needed a bargaining chip. He needed hostages. And if this plan had worked, the Germans could have basically said, we're going to hold these Allied armies here in the north hostage until you negotiate a peace with us. Whatever the plan, it failed. The Germans come nowhere near Antwerp. However, they do make a large penetration here into Belgium, starting on about December, I believe, 16th, 1944, because they had been husbanding and squirreling away men and materiel, especially new tanks like the 60-ton King Tiger. These are massive vehicles that the Allies had not encountered yet. And many of you have watched the movie Fury, and you'd seen the climactic tank battle between the Sherman tank that Brad Pitt commands and the Tiger I. Well, the Tiger I was an incredibly deadly tank to Allied tankers. The Tiger II was even heavier, more heavily armored, and its 88mm gun was longer and thus able to penetrate even more armor. The only way a Sherman could take out a King Tiger was to get in close and get behind it. There was no way to even take it out from the sides. You could take out a Tiger I, if lucky, from the sides. There was no way to take out a Tiger II from the sides. The problem for the Germans is that with vehicles like the Tiger II, they needed roads. These vehicles were so heavy that even in good weather, they could not ford rivers and they couldn't operate well over mushy ground. And so in December of 1944, except during the days when the ground froze, the German vehicles, whether it be the Tiger IIs or their lighter weight Mark I or Mark IV tanks or half-tracks, needed the roads in order to quickly move, because again, like Market Garden, the German plan, which was Operation Watch on the Rhine, needed to stick to the timetable. And so those Allied troops that are first hit by the Germans, while many of them are annihilated, like the American 106th Division, a division that had just arrived in Europe just a few weeks before, had not been battle-tested. These guys are as green as you can get. While they are overrun, some of these green troops hold out just long enough to disrupt the German timetable. So does the 28th Division, a division that had been chewed up in a previous battle, the so-called Battle of the Hurtgen Forest. They had been sent to the Ardennes because it was a quiet sector. They too fight hard. Troops that are not frontline combat troops, artillerymen, support troops. While they fight in a disorganized fashion, many of them fight as best they can. The Germans did not expect that. They expected to get beyond the front lines and then have sort of what you might call clear sailing. They didn't. So when you watch shows like Band of Brothers and you see, of course, the 101 arriving at Belgium and you see these panicked troops pouring back, yes, many of these troops were panicked and moving to the rear. But the reason why they were panicked is because they had been thrown into the battle without any clear defensive plan. And they had seen their buddies gunned down, shot. They had fought against these monstrous Tiger IIs. And they had bought the 101 time to get to Bastogne. Now, of course, famously, the 101st Division holds out at Bastogne, along with remnants of the 28th, along with remnants of armored divisions that had been blown apart, and their surviving tanks had made it back to Bastogne. These orphan units had contributed also to the defense of Bastogne, until relieved by, most famously, George S. Patton, whose Third Army down here turned 90 degrees and attacked into the German flank, not only liberating Bastogne, but also reducing the Bulge. By mid-January 1945, the battle lines were back to approximately where they were at before the Battle of the Bulge. Now, let's switch gears and let's talk about what was going on in the Pacific at the same time. Because this is the amazing fact of the Allied war effort, especially the American war effort, is that before World War II, before our entry into the war, FDR and American war planners had assumed that we'd have to defeat one enemy first before going after the other. But American industry had risen to the challenge so well that by mid-1943, the war in the Pacific was an offensive war, meaning that the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Army were fighting to retake islands and push the Japanese back toward the Japanese home islands in the same fashion that the Allies were fighting first in North Africa and Italy, and then finally fighting in northern France to push the Germans back. Now, if we look at a map, and we'll look at a map here in just a second, there are actually two American drives across the Pacific. One led by this man right here. This is General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur, of course, had been in command of the defense of the Philippines in 1941 and 1942, and had been ordered out of the Philippines directly by FDR for fear that such a high-ranking official being captured by the Japanese would be a major propaganda coup for them. Now, ever since then, MacArthur had promised, "I shall return," and had been slogging up the New Guinea coast toward the Philippines. At the same time, the Navy, under the command of Admiral Chester Nimitz, was slogging its way across the Central Pacific. So if we look at a map, we can see the simplified diagram of these thrusts. We see MacArthur here, fighting up the northern Solomon Islands, the Army taking over from the Marines after the Battle of Guadalcanal, fighting up the Bismarck Archipelago and the northern coast of New Guinea. And by 1943, early 1944, MacArthur's forces are right here. Similarly, coming out of Pearl Harbor after the Battle of Midway, the Navy, using the Marines as its ground forces, have fought to take islands in the Marshalls, and by 1944, they are eyeing the Marianas here. These twin thrusts were supposed to be complementing, like a boxer with a good right and a left, keeping the Japanese off balance. As one thrust would, have an offensive, the Japanese would, of course, try and reinforce their defenders, say, over here, only to be met by a second thrust over here, and vice versa. Now, oftentimes, however, the Army under MacArthur and the Navy under Nimitz conflicted with each other over planning, because the Navy felt that it was the best, had the best route to Japan, using naval forces, of course, to go directly toward the heart of the Japanese Empire. Of course, MacArthur believed that the Army, having the vast number of troops, needed to, of course, march up and, invade Japan, and, of course, the Army leading the way. So you have this service rivalry between the two. And the best indication of how these two differ in planning is whether or not to reinvade and liberate the Philippines. In early 1943, the Navy favored leaving the Philippines to wither on the vine because, especially here in the Central Pacific, the Navy did not invade all of these islands. Like, for example, if you see this little island right here called Truk. Truk was a major Japanese naval base. We never invaded it. We never took it. Instead, the Navy simply bombed the crap out of it, reducing the port facilities to nothing, and then cut it off via our superior naval forces and let the Japanese who were there to starve. This becomes known as the island hopping campaign, where the Americans only invade where they absolutely have to invade and leave the rest of the islands to wither on the vine. The Navy believed that the Japanese had too many forces in the Philippines. It would slow down the advance too much, and thus we should just cut it off, and MacArthur's forces should instead invade Formosa here, protecting the Navy's flank as it invaded Iwo Jima and then later Okinawa. Of course, MacArthur believed no. He argued that the Americans should reinforce the Philippines, should retake the Philippines. And of course, this conflict was only solved after a meeting between the two leaders and President Roosevelt himself. And MacArthur persuaded not only Roosevelt, but also Nimitz. His argument was simple. He had promised to return to the Philippines. The Filipinos and the few Americans who were able to escape getting captured by the Japanese had fought since 1942 to tie down Japanese troops here in the Philippines. Japanese troops that could have been met on the battlefields that here in the Central Pacific or down here in New Guinea. He had promised to return. And how could the Americans, how could they ask people here in Asia to support them if the United States government basically told the Filipinos that, hey, keep fighting until we win this thing by invading Japan. Keep suffering until we knock the Japanese out by invading Japan. It could be years, but keep on suffering. MacArthur also pointed out that there were hundreds, thousands of American POWs suffering in the Philippines, and that it was our moral duty to free not only the Filipino people, but to free those Americans in those POW camps. And of course, FDR bought the argument. Nimitz even finally bought the argument. And so, it's during the battle to free the Philippines that we see not only climactic battles on land, that we see in movies like, for example, The Great Raid, where Army Rangers free the Cabanatuan prisoner of war camp. But we also see that as MacArthur and his Navy, because the Navy has to give him ships, so there is a fleet called the 7th Fleet that is commanded directly by MacArthur. But it's also a battle where the Navy's main striking fleet, the 3rd Fleet, comes over from its drive to support the invasion of the Philippines. And we see this climactic battle known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Now, if you guys want to read about some real heroism, we don't have time in this lecture, but read about a group of sailors in a part of the 7th Fleet known as Taffy 3, and how these destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3, a supporting force of the invasion, defended against the main Japanese striking force, where you have the battleship Yamato with its 18.1-inch guns, heavy cruisers, faced off between two destroyers with 5-inch guns and destroyer escorts with 4- and 5-inch guns. And the fact that the destroyers and Taffy 3, while Taffy 3 is almost completely blown away, fight so hard and heroically during the battle off Samar that the Japanese thought that they had not run into a small little contingent of the 7th Fleet, but instead thought they had run into the vast striking force of William Halsey, the American admiral in charge of the 3rd Fleet. Now, after the Battle of Luzon, or the Battle of the Philippines, these two navies, of course, these two striking forces will continue on, while MacArthur secures the rest of the Philippines after the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Nimitz's fleet, which is sometimes called the 3rd Fleet when it's under the command of William Halsey, and sometimes called the 5th Fleet when it's under the command of a fellow by the name of Carleton Sprague. The reason why the designation changes is simple. The ships don't change, the men don't change. But when Halsey is in command, Sprague is back here in Pearl Harbor planning with Nimitz for the next invasion. And so we see this back and forth. So the 3rd Fleet, under the command of Halsey, is here. But when what was the 3rd Fleet, now the 5th Fleet, invades Iwo Jima in early 1945, it's the 5th Fleet under Sprague. Now, before we talk about the invasion of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, let's continue and talk about the end of the war in Europe. Now, one thing we must remember is that the Allies in the West are not fighting alone. If we go back, the Russians, having been mauled in 1941 and 1942, by 43 have recovered. And during 1944, they are pushing the Germans back out of Soviet territory, and by the end of 1944, they are here poised along the old border between Poland and Romania, Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia. So, starting at the end of 1944, but really picking up speed in 1945, you see the Russians, the Soviets, staging massive operations, like, for example, the Belarusian Strategic Offensive Operation. Only the Soviets could come up with a name like that. Where you see the Belarusian Strategic Army, that's what they called it, pour from what is Belorussia right here, and Ukraine, into Poland. By the end of this offensive, which lasts until March of 1945, the Russians go from approximately here to the old Polish-German border. They are basically poised along the Vistula River right here, just a few miles, just like 50 miles from Berlin. Whoops. Now, I should go back. Sorry about that. While this is going on in the east, the Allies have penetrated the German Western Wall. Now, this wall, which was similar to the Maginot Line of the French, had been intended and built during the interwar period to defend Germany against just such an invasion. The problem is Hitler's Battle of the Bulge had drained the troops in the West. General Eisenhower had stated famously that Hitler and the Nazis had done the Allies a favor by coming out of their bunkers during the Battle of the Bulge and allowed us to kill them there. Because when the Allies go up against the Western Wall, while it is tough going in some sectors, it is far easier than what it would have been if those had been fully manned installations, because many of the pillboxes are not even manned. Others are. And so the Allies are able to finally break through and get to the Rhine River by early 1945. Now, during this time period, the Germans were demolishing all the bridges across the Rhine River. The Rhine, which is as wide as the Mississippi, but flows far faster, was a major hurdle, because if the bridges were blown, the Allies would have to stage another amphibious operation, something akin to the D-Day operation, against a hardened enemy on their side of the riverbank. However, here, where the 1st and 9th Armies linked up, the U.S. armies that are fighting in Europe, in the 9th Armored Sector, let's see here, the 9th Armored Division sector, the German town of Remagen, their railroad bridge, known as the Ludendorff Railroad Bridge, was still standing. The Germans had rigged it to detonate, to be demolished, but hadn't done it yet. And so troops of the 9th Armored Division rush across the bridge, and they get halfway across when the Germans push the plunger. The bridge goes up and then settles right back down on its moorings. Only about half the explosives went off. The Germans, in their haste, had rigged the bridge incorrectly. While the bridge was heavily damaged with steel members cut in half by explosives, it was not enough to bring the bridge down. So how many of you would like to be American soldiers who were ordered to rush across the bridge in the first place, seeing the thing rigged with explosives, knowing it could go up at any minute, and then ride this thing when it went up? How many of you would stay on the bridge and continue going across toward the German lines, knowing that any minute that bridge could collapse and you'd be cut off on the German side of the river? Well, these American troops did. As soon as not a beachhead, but a bridgehead as it's known, was secured on the opposing side, the Americans start pouring troops and tanks across the bridge. Again, I can only imagine tankers driving 26-ton Shermans across this bridge, seeing that it's heavily damaged. What was going through their minds? At the same time that this was going on, American combat engineers swarmed over the bridge like ants, trying to fix it as best they could. Other combat engineers tried to throw across floating pontoon bridges, basically giant inflatable rafts with metal saddles attached to them where you laid a metal bridge across them. The Germans poured everything they could at this bridge. This single bridge became the focal point of all German artillery within range. Jet bomber attacks. The Germans had developed not only jet fighters, but jet bombers, streaked in to try and take this bridge out. Dive bombers came in and tried to bomb it. And all the while, Americans are pouring across it, knowing that this bridge has already been damaged. Now, luckily, not just one, but finally 2 floating pontoon bridges are built across the Rhine. Just in time, because just as the first one goes into operation, the Ludendorff, with combat engineers on it, with a whole train of ambulance coming back from the front, the Ludendorff collapses into the Rhine River. Loss of life is heavy because of this. But despite this, the Americans have a firm footing on the side of the Rhine. But it's not just at Remagen, because just about a week later, south of Remagen in the 3rd Army sector, General Patton's troops throw a pontoon bridge across. And then finally, up here in the Netherlands and Belgium, the British finally get across the Rhine. So now the Allies are not just across the Rhine in one spot, but several places, and they pour men and material across. The Allies waste no time in pushing as fast as they can into Germany. By this stage in the war, the Germans are in full retreat. Some units are fighting hard. Others are fighting merely to put up a fight and then surrender. Now, this brings up something interesting. The Germans here in the east will fight like crazy to keep the Russians out. Even when it becomes clear that Germany is lost, the Germans will continue to fight like mad against the Soviets. However, as it becomes obvious that Germany is lost here in the West, many German commanders will give up wholesale. They will actually send their troops back east, letting the Allies march into Germany, because the idea is simple. The Germans would much rather be occupied by the British and the French than by the Russians. The Germans had treated the Slavic peoples here, the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, they had treated these people horribly. They had massacred them. And now they feared what was coming and what would actually come, which would be, of course, retribution at the hands of Soviet troops. And so we see Germany being squeezed. Now, here, right above where the A is in Germany, the Allies will meet up with the Russians at a small town called Torgau, cutting Germany in half north and south. Does this mean the war is over? No, because as the Allies are meeting, the Russians are starting to surround Berlin. This is another controversial time in history, because we, the Western Allies, could have been part of that battle for Berlin. But it had already been determined that everything east of the Elbe River here would be Soviet territory. They would be occupied by the Soviets. And Eisenhower, rightly or wrongly, said that Americans would not fight and die for territory we would have to give up later on. So those American troops that were already across the Elbe River were recalled, and we sat and waited for the Russians to basically capture Berlin, which occurred on August 20th, 1945, after probably one of the harshest battles in World War II history. The Germans, of course, take their retribution on not only soldiers but civilians. You know, men in Berlin face summary execution for the slightest of infractions, and Berlin women are raped wholesale. Some reports go as high as 90,000 women from the ages of 9 to 90 are subject to rape at the hands of Soviet troops. Now, by late April, it is obvious that Germany is done. However, the formal surrender is not taken until May 7th and May 8th of 1945. In late April of 1945, representatives of the German government, now led by Karl Dönitz, because Hitler commits suicide before the Russians take Berlin. Karl Dönitz sends representatives to the Western Allies asking to surrender only to them, not the Soviets. However, Eisenhower, after getting word of this, sends a response saying that you surrender to everybody or we keep killing you. And so on May 7th, at the headquarters of Bernard Montgomery in the northern sector of the front, the Germans surrender to the Western Allies, and the next day, outside of Berlin, different German representatives surrender at the headquarters of the Soviet commander Georgy Zhukov to the Soviets. VE Day, victory in Europe. So while you see partying and celebration in London, you do not see it in New York, because Americans fully realize that we are still embroiled in a war in the Pacific. Now, this war, of course, has been going on and getting far more brutal as the months go by. We see, of course, the Allies, the Americans mainly, flying bomber missions from the Marianas to bomb Japan. The Marianas are here, Guam, you see on the map, but also Tinian and Saipan. Bombing Japan, these 13-hour trips are taking a heavy toll, not just on the Japanese, but of course the American bomber crews. Bomber crews are being shot down, the planes heavily damaged, some being forced to ditch here in the ocean, never to be seen again. This is one reason why the Navy will take Iwo Jima starting on February 19th till March 11th, 1945. Iwo Jima had been used by the Japanese as an early warning station and as a fighter base. In American hands, Iwo Jima would allow for, of course, American fighters to follow the bombers all the way to Japan, and also give a way station for aircraft that were damaged during these raids so that they could land here rather than having to fly all the way back here. But the Allies, the Americans, since this is an American war right here, the Americans need a springboard to Japan. Iwo Jima is too small. Okinawa, being closer and larger, is ideal. And so, starting in, let's see here, April of 1945, we again see the convergence of the Army-led prong and the Navy-led prong here off of Okinawa, as the Army and the Marines take Okinawa in probably one of the most bloody battles of the Pacific War, where over 49,000 American casualties are incurred, 12,000 of which are battle casualties. It is the fighting on Iwo Jima and Okinawa that convinces the Americans that taking Japan is going to be probably a battle that will cost over 1.5 million battle casualties, maybe even more, and that it will last into 1946. The plan to invade Japan was known as Operation Olympic Coronet. The Olympic phase would have attacked Japan here on Kyushu in November of 1945. Coronet would have landed here on the Tokyo Plain in March of 1946. However, secretly, the Americans had been developing the atomic bombs. The atomic bombs, of course, would be used to hopefully end the war and end it before we had to invade Japan. So, let's see here. On August 6, 1945, one B-29 drops a bomb on Hiroshima on the island of Kyushu. 90,000 Japanese are killed immediately or within the next week or so. On August 9th, 3 days later, another American B-29 drops a similar bomb on Nagasaki. 35,000 Japanese die within the week. Now, why the discrepancy? Well, single B-29s were common sights over Japan on photo reconnaissance missions. So when the Enola Gay, the bomber that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, was overhead, the Japanese thought nothing of it, and so they didn't get in their air raid shelters. However, those at Nagasaki tried to seek cover. However, it's a freaking atomic bomb. So 35,000 of them died. This is not counting those people who die years later due to radiation or cancer. Between these two invasions, on August 8th, the Soviet Union invades Manchuria and northern China, engaging Japanese armies there. The combination of these events will lead the Japanese to seek a surrender. Remember, I told you guys that before Pearl Harbor there were two factions. We called them the moderate and the hardliners. The bombings and the Soviet invasion caused the moderates to gain just enough power to argue that they needed to surrender. Now, the hardliners, of course, would not go down without a fight. The hardliners advocated that the Japanese fight to the very last man, and the hardline military officers of the army actually tried to stage a coup against the emperor. They seize the Parliament building, they arrest some of the moderates, they actually kill a few of them, and they try and kidnap the emperor. However, the emperor had cut a record, and one of his trusted aides had snuck it out of the imperial palace before the army arrived, and then played it on the central radio station of Tokyo. This radio was the emperor himself, telling the Japanese people that they must bear the unbearable. Now, the army could secretly go against the emperor, but they could not publicly go against the emperor. The Japanese people would not allow that. And thus the army was forced to agree with the moderates, and an armistice was sought, so that by the end of August 1945, fighting had ended in the Pacific. And then on September 2nd, 1945, we see Japanese representatives meeting with the Allied forces to surrender on the battleship Missouri. Now, the reason why they surrendered on the Missouri was not only did the Missouri look cool, but also many in the Allied camp feared that some Japanese would not agree with the surrender and attack the ceremonies, and that a battleship with 14 inches of deck armor, if an attack occurred, all of these important high brass, officers could seek refuge in the belly of this armored beast and be protected far better than on an aircraft carrier. And thus the war comes to an end. Now, what are the effects of World War II? Well, simply put, America takes the lead. America will not only be the economic, but also the political and military leader of the Western world. The nature of war changes. At the beginning of the war, we see people still fighting with biplanes and cavalry. At the end of the war, we see planes like this, the B-29 in this production photo, dropping bombs like this. We see massive numbers of people killed, most famously the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews and about 7 million other people are systematically exterminated by the Germans. But on top of this, in terms of battle and non-battle casualties, somewhere around 100 million people lose their lives. We see advances in technology, both good and bad. Of course, we see the A-bomb, but planes like the B-29 here, its technologies can be reused and turned into advanced commercial aircraft. Radio and radio guidance can be used for television and radio communication. Penicillin, which was the wonder drug of the battlefield, will help solve diseases in the post-war period. We see, of course, the baby boom when, especially Americans, but others come back home. They want that peacetime dream that they had not had since the beginning of World War I in a lot of cases. And so we see the greatest generation giving birth to the largest generation in American history. We see, of course, women and minorities who had been let into the workplace. Well, many of them were laid off, but that taste of the good life, that taste of a good paycheck, that taste of being treated more equal than you had been before, will help lead to, first, of course, the civil rights movement of the 1950s, and, of course, the women's rights movement of the 60s and 70s. We also see the breakdown of European empires, because European empires are both bankrupted by the war, but also proven that they are not the invincible European empires that many of their colonies, their colonial peoples, believe them to be. So nationalist movements, after seeing the Europeans beat by the Japanese, fellow Asians, will, of course, either peacefully seek independence and sometimes violently seek independence. And, of course, the big effect of World War II that we will talk about on Monday is, of course, the Cold War. I will see you guys then. Bye-bye.